whether you've been naughty or nice, the Greggs Festive Bake has arrived, delivered exclusively by Just Eat. Did somebody say Just Eat?
Well, as the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said earlier today, it has been a long and winding road to a post-Brexit trade deal, and it's been a bumpy one. Rob Powell reports on how we got here.
The moment the UK left the European Union, the end of one torturous political saga, the start of another. Within weeks of Brexit Day, UK negotiators were back in Brussels. It didn't take long for the divisions to emerge.
Our differences come as no surprise, especially after only one round of negotiations, but some are very, very difficult.
As the COVID pandemic hit, talks moved online, but stubborn sticking points remained. Access to fishing waters, along with how closely the UK would follow EU rules and how the deal would be enforced and governed.
It is the first trade agreement that will lead to more barriers to trade rather than reduce the barriers to trade. So in a sense, the UK and the EU were really concerned about, well, how do we ensure that we continue having great access to each other's markets, but also the freedom to do what we like on the site and to prevent the other from accessing the market and distorting competition.
For Boris Johnson's predecessor, resolving that perennial Brexit tension between access and control was to prove an impossible task. In divorce talks with the EU, Theresa May initially aimed for a more distant relationship, but faced with rejection in Brussels, was forced to change tack. That had consequences back home though, with the then Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson resigning in protest at the plan, saying it risked the UK becoming a colony of the EU.
Order!
And MPs agreed.
The noes to the left, 344.
Rejecting the deal 3 times. Forced into a Brexit delay she had previously ruled out, Theresa May resigned.
But with enormous and enduring gratitude to have had the opportunity to serve the country I love.
Taking over in number 10, Boris Johnson promised a fresh approach to negotiations and a hard deadline.
Can you make a promise today to the British public that you will not go back to Brussels and ask for another delay to Brexit?
Yes.
And
I can.
And would you
I'd rather be dead in a ditch.
A last-minute meeting with the Irish Prime Minister eventually paved the way for a deal. But it was an election that followed, as the Commons became stuck in a stalemate and refused to back the Prime Minister's plans. Vowing to get Brexit done, Boris Johnson fought the campaign, promising an oven-ready deal.
The exit poll is indicating it's a Conservative win.
The strategy worked. A thumping majority was gifted to the Conservatives, Brexit now certain, but still far from done. Boris Johnson promised an end to squabbling about the EU, but in reality his divorce deal left loose ends on one key issue. The new mechanism to keep the Irish border open ceded powers to Brussels and created a new frontier in the Irish Sea, something the Prime Minister had previously said he would never do. And that's why arguments over this border flared again during this year's talks, when Boris Johnson tabled laws that would unpick parts of the agreement he'd signed just months before. They were eventually withdrawn, but not before this shock admission from a cabinet minister.
Yes, this does break international law in a very specific and limited way.
Amid anger from the EU and with trust running low, negotiations seem to be petering out.
I concluded that we should get ready for January the 1st with arrangements that are more like Australia's, based on simple principles of global free trade.
Whether that was genuine or just theatrics, negotiations did restart.
Mr. Barnier, was it a success in London?
But with little progress to report, it was left to the politicians to intervene. A dinner between Boris Johnson and the EU Commission President was arranged. At first, the gaps between the two sides seemed too wide, but then, at the last minute, a breakthrough and a deal. So is this the end of the Brexit story?
We haven't really changed our trade policy relative to third countries. If Brexit means we can have our own trade policy, we're going to have to go back and negotiate changes with these other countries. So, no, it's going to run and run.
More than 50 months since the country voted to leave, we now have some clarity on the relationship we'll have with our closest neighbour. The true legacy of Brexit, though, will be how the UK uses its newfound freedoms. Rob Powell, Sky News in Westminster.
More than 2,000 lorry drivers are waiting to leave the Port of Dover after testing negative for coronavirus, with 800 extra service personnel being deployed to help with testing on Christmas Day. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps says that ferries from Dover to Calais will continue tomorrow and Boxing Day, and has asked drivers to try and be patient. French firefighters and 300 British military personnel are already working with NHS Test and Trace to work through the drivers, 3 of whom have tested positive. Now let's take a look at the forecast. Well, the Highlands and the North York Moors may see a white Christmas, but it'll be dry and bright elsewhere. Storm Bella sweeps in on Boxing Day with an early forecast of wind gusts in excess of 70 miles an hour through the south. And then it will be a mostly dry start to Christmas Day with just a few coastal showers in both the west and the east. Elsewhere, it'll be a cold, frosty start with the risk of some icy stretches, particularly in the east. Larger amounts of cloud over Scotland and Northern Ireland will bring showery outbreaks of rain or hail snow, and these will become more widespread through the morning. Temperatures will be in low single figures, but it will feel quite pleasant in light winds, and the afternoon will bring organised rain and hail snow into the northwest, and the winds will freshen. On Saturday, Storm Bella will bring heavy rain and gales southwards, and a yellow warning is in place. Coming up at midnight on Christmas Day, the UK and the European Union finally reach a trade agreement just days before the deadline.
For Schwartz, we give our cinnamon the time to reach perfection, so when you sprinkle it, you end up with something that tastes just like Christmas. Schwartz, picked with care, packed with flavour.
Chasing it, could get it in 2 laps.
How can you know that?
It's going to be less busy at the front of the train.
How can you tell? It's not here yet. How did you get that money? I'm so hungry.
The food's already here.
Huh? How did you know that?
Okay, there's up to 50% off in the Aston chat sale. First, let electronics. Then, George. Handle the bottles, you distract them.
Look, my daddy.
Yes, and you say...
Oh, we can just do it online.
That's husband price.
Santagur. Smooth, creamy, and intense.
I am a mighty forest. You are my petite flower.
What on earth are you doing? Get on with it. Santagur. Sinfully delicious blue.
Clouds come and go, but the sun keeps shining. Soon, you can rediscover the magic. Our landscapes are even more beautiful than before. Our cities are even more inspiring. Our hospitality is even more heartfelt. Feel the sun on your face and the warmth on your skin. Step into the light. Feel
make your own rules.
It all started with one man, Filippo Berio. His signature, our promise.
Can you turn off that background, please?
Suffering from house harassment? Get up to 50% off showroom kitchen units at Wigs.
A whole hazelnut, dipped in smooth, velvety filling, wrapped in a crispy wafer, coated in milk chocolate and covered in hazelnut pieces. Ferrero Rocher, celebrate the moment. Locked in each Loa aluminium capsule, discover the finest flavors. You're a masterpiece in taste.
A collection of festive movies to make your Christmas.
Love it.
On Sky Cinema.
I've just never seen so much stuff.
Hello, Jimmy. Remember me?
Oh, for God's sake!
Don't shout at me, I'm trying to remember, I'm getting old.
Good morning. 2020 has been a year like no other. Jane Secker's joined by a virtual panel to look back at the year that changed the world. Here's a 2020 year in review.
Hello and welcome to Year in Review. Now, it's fair to say that few of us will remember 2020 with much affection, but there was a lot of news worth looking back on, analysing and, where we can, gently mocking. We'll also look ahead to what could await us in 2021, be it the economic outlook or just the ability to go to the pub without having to worry about Scotch eggs. So do stay with us for the next hour as we're joined by the editor-at-large for politics.co.uk, Ian Dunt, the economics correspondent for The Spectator, Kate Andrews, also the Observer's chief leader writer, Sonia Soda, and the chief executive of Conservative Home, Mark Wallace. Thank you all very much for joining us. Ian, we're going to start with you. There's no getting around it. The COVID-19 pandemic has really dominated the news this year. So we've asked each guest to choose one aspect of the story that stood out for them. Ian, what was that aspect as far as you were concerned?
The government's complete inability to handle it. COVID is basically like looking at the light from a distant star, right? So from the moment that you actually have to impose a policy, you're dealing with events that took place a month ago. People take about 2 weeks to get seriously sick once they have it. They're usually in hospital for about 2 weeks before they die, if indeed that's what happens. So we were looking at events, the origins of which had already happened. And if you look at government policy throughout the last year, it was this entirely reactive process of dealing with things 2 weeks too late, 3 weeks too late, 4 weeks too late. They were too late on the first lockdown. They were too late really in bringing in the tiers, trying to explain to people how things were going to function after the lockdown. They were told that the tiers were ineffective. They continued with them anyway. They were too late for the second lockdown. They're now making the same sort of mistakes over Christmas. In the background of all of that, you have track and trace, which we were promised in this kind of tub-thumping, jingoistic way would be this British success story, and in fact it's just this mess of privatised, subcontracted, ineffective programming. Throughout that, what you have seen is tens of thousands of deaths of people that did not need to take place if the government was on top of what it was doing. It was late, every step of the way, and it is a degree of government failure which we simply haven't seen in our life.
Okay, full marks for bringing in a star so early on this programme. Kate, do you think it's a fair assessment? I mean, none of us knew what this pandemic was going to bring. Lots of different countries handled it in lots of different ways. Why was the British way of handling it wrong?
Well, look, I think a lot of mistakes have been made along the way, and Anne has pointed a fair few of them out. I'm not as convinced that having lockdown days a week earlier would have necessarily resulted in as many lives saved as Anne and I both hope.
would do. I think what we've seen, the data from circuit breakers in Wales, from lockdowns in England, especially the second time round, would suggest that the infection rate goes up and down, not always necessarily when you want it to. Wales circuit breaker more or less seems to be a failure now in getting infections under control. So I don't think it's as straightforward as that. But England in particular, the UK as a whole, has a lot to answer for when it comes to that number of excess deaths. In the first wave of coronavirus, it was indeed the worst in Europe. That is a painful track record, and one that you can tell through decisions that have been made more recently the government really wants to correct.
Mark, you're a Conservative supporter, editor of Conservative Home. Your issue with how it's been handled is one particular element, it's the messaging.
Well, I think as Ian and Kate just said, there's lots of different issues, but one thing that particularly struck me was that once you had that decision to lock down, you had that incredibly clear message, the stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. You had the deployment of the massive popularity of the NHS in the messaging. You even had the Queen coming on TV to help get the message across. And there's quite a lot of evidence saying that message had a huge cut through, much more than any other government information message that I can think of in recent years. But what was quite striking and shocking was that after that, the whole thing seemed to come off the rails in terms of communication. If you're talking about the rules and the official policy are one thing, but communicating what you're doing, how people should react to it, what happens next, and how we're going to continue dealing with something that's not for a matter of weeks, but months, even flowing into 2021, communication is really, really important. So what seemed to happen was that people, including the press, didn't get the really clear early signs of exactly what the route was going to be through this, how the rules were going to change in time. And once they did start changing, they weren't always as clear as they should have been. And again, you end up now at the end of the tail end of the year, because the idea was set out very early on that the rules will specify every single thing about what you ought to do. The government has made a rod for its own back, and therefore every time they come up with any set of rules, people then come back and say, well, exactly how big should the Scotch egg be in order to be able to sit down and have a drink with it? But that is something that's a product of comms that went wrong. And if you consider how big the communication PR state is, how expensive it is, it's quite shocking that happened.
Let's bring Sonia in on this. I mean, Sonia, we think back to big government campaigns, road safety campaigns, clunk, click for every trick, dig for victory. These are all things that really stick in the head, don't they? Hands, knees, face, it immediately went viral. Hands, knees, shoulders, heads and toes, hands, knees, bottoms to daisy. What was the government getting wrong?
Well, I agree with Mark. I think simplicity of messaging is really, really important. But the other thing that's so important when you're looking to communicate very important public health messages is engendering a sense of, we're all doing this together. This is for the common good. And I think the government really got that right with its first set of messaging. It was like, we've all got to do this together. We've all got to stay home to protect the NHS and to save lives. So that was quite effective at triggering this idea that we're not just staying home to keep ourselves safe, we're staying home to keep the people safe who have to go out to work every day, who can't stay at home because of the jobs that they've got, keeping the economy and the healthcare system running. I think, though, that very quickly that did start to break down, and the government moved to instead to sort of suggest that actually there was, the individuals were to blame when things went wrong. They would point to pictures of people congregating or breaking the rules, etc. Whereas actually we know that the public during the first lockdown really stuck to it, and they really did stick to the rules. So I think this idea that, it's all young people's fault for doing this, or it's another group's fault for doing that, that is actually really corrosive to getting people to sort of comply with public health messaging, because it's got to come from a good place. It's got to be about what we're all doing, for each other, rather than this idea that sort of you're laying the path for blaming groups of individuals. And I think actually there's quite a contrast between the way Boris Johnson has handled this and Nicola Sturgeon as a communicator, because Nicola Sturgeon has much more, rather than sort of focus on groups that might be to blame or focusing on the sticks, she's focused much more on the idea that this is a collective social responsibility and we're all in it together.
And in in terms of the response, you wanted to jump out of the Westminster bubble a little bit, didn't you, and look at inequality and what COVID has highlighted.
That's right. So I think one of the big things this pandemic has sort of lifted the corner of the carpet back on is the massive structural inequalities that afflict us in society. And I think that's true at a very basic level, on a health level. So during the first lockdown, people in white-collar professional jobs, it's much easier for you to stay at home and keep yourself safe than if you're in low-paid essential work, if you're collecting the bins, for example, if you're a hospital porter. So I think the pandemic really revealed big class-based inequalities in your ability to keep yourself safe. I think as we experience the economic impacts more and more people tragically lose their jobs, we're going to hear much more about the inadequacy of unemployment benefit. Families who never expected to be living on unemployment benefit, parents losing their jobs as a result of this pandemic, they're going to find that after 10 years of cuts to tax credits and benefits, it really isn't very much money at all. And then a couple of other sorts of inequality that I would mention. First of all, educational inequality. We know that the gap between children from richer and poorer backgrounds has got a lot bigger as a result of all that time children had off school. The government just didn't do enough to ensure that children from poorer homes and disadvantaged homes were getting learning opportunities, over the summer holidays, for example, to help them catch up. And then lastly, gender inequality. Again, we know from surveys that it's very much women who have picked up the brunt of the domestic work, of childcare, of looking after the kids while you're trying to work from home, of the emotional labour of making sure that everyone's okay. And that's going to have real and long-lasting impact on women's roles in the workplace.
Mark, I mean, it was also fair to sort of look at the population and say all of us didn't exactly cover ourselves in glory, did we? I mean, all of the panic buying in supermarkets, the stockpiling. What does that tell us about society?
Well, to a certain extent, these things are natural. They might not be desirable. Nobody really wants to be to see anybody fighting each other for toilet roll. But to a certain extent, these are things that happen in a crisis. The fact is that you can look back and see the way in which news of a supposed toilet roll shortage that now seems never really existed, spread around the world through different media platforms, through social media, through rumours and so on. People will react to a crisis in very deep-seated ways, which are much older than any of the kind of media or government systems we're talking about. But there is a responsibility, of course, to work out how to address it. It's weird, I think, that one thing we've seen in this is that at times it's felt like politicians have placed too much weight on sometimes untested and behavioural science. There's quite a lot of scepticism from epidemiologists about the idea that people were going to tire of lockdown quickly, or of lockdown compliance quickly. But at other times, you can foresee things like stockpiling, and it seems like things like that haven't been given the proper weight in terms of planning ahead as to how people are going to react to things, whether you like it or not.
Let's bring in Kate, because it's the economic impact that you're really fascinated with, and it does seem like the government managed to find its magic money tree, and Rishi Sunak was keen to spend it and spend it and spend it. Once that's been found, what's the economic impact of us not really being able to ever unsee that magic money tree again?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think everybody's wondering when its branches might start falling off, but for now it continues to grow in the Bank of England, and this Conservative government is by no means going to stop spending that money. Now, I think economists on the left and the right would agree that if there's any time to spend a heck of a lot of money on a one-off spending spree, it is during a pandemic. But what I've been most fascinated by is the fact that the government keeps telling us that lockdowns are a matter of trade-offs, and they take these trade-offs very seriously, especially as they relate to the economic impact and also the non-COVID health impact. And yet, in action, they seem to hold those things as being very secondary to the immediate COVID crisis. And I was most shocked that it turned out in November that the Treasury had not bothered to model the economic impact of the tier restrictions or specific lockdown restrictions. So from the 10 p.m. curfew to crackdowns on socializing, they hadn't tried to model the economic impact of that. Now, models are difficult. They're often wrong. We've seen that often as we try to model the virus trajectory itself, but at least it's something government can give you that you can hold to account, and you can ask questions and you can dissect. And Boris Johnson promised to release his assessment of the tier system, the social and economic and health impact of that. And when we actually read it a few weeks back, it turned out to be a justification justification as to why the government wasn't going to give us any data. The Times says there is a secret dossier that reveals the economic impact, that it's not something that they're sharing with the public. Now, anyone who's been under these lockdown restrictions knows full well what that's doing to their community, to local business. The hospitality sector in particular is under so much strain at the moment. And I just find it quite unbelievable, really, that you can make the argument for lockdown and you can make it wholeheartedly, but you would expect, if they're really talking about trade-offs, that they would assess some of the other things and the medium to long-term health impacts on people from a struggling economy and from many patients not being able to access care. And I just don't think from government we've seen anywhere near enough of the actual breakdown of these trade-offs and what they mean for the public.
Okay, a lot of negatives there about COVID. Thank you all very much for bringing those. But also some positives. Let's not forget clap for carers. Let's not forget all of us using digital technology a lot more and all of us looking out for our neighbours. Well, after the break, other choices for big stories that got us talking this year. So stay tuned.
It's time. Can you say? No runners. Welcome to the future.
Chasing it, could get it in 2 laps.
How can he know that?
It's going to be less busy at the front of the train.
How can he tell? It's not here yet. How did you get that money? I'm so hungry.
The food's already here.
Huh? How did you know that?
Cold and flu won't let you sleep. Time to take action. Night Nurse. Its unbeatable strength helps put your symptoms to bed. Only available at the pharmacy counter.
Have the summer holiday you deserve with Jet2 Holidays. We're giving you a huge £100 off per person. With 22 kilograms of baggage included, plus 10 kilograms of hand luggage too. So book now for this summer. Jet2 Holidays. Package holidays you can trust. Ultra natural protected.
Lunch gathering. You've got the Christmas spirit. You shall always be a good sport.
Polar bear, salmon.
And never ever give up.
Like you're all doing different things.
Spirits like yours deserve long-lasting bubbles like these. Sure, we've got the tonic, you've got the spirit.
Christmas is on, and so are we. Get delicious festive dishes from your favourite restaurants on Deliveroo.
What if today could be your day on Apple Casino? What if you could go on a unique adventure with Book of Ra and have a chance with Lady Luck? Sign up on Apple Casino and start your journey.
Thanks to Rennie, Dinner Supremo, for me and my jalapeno.
What are you doing?
For fast relief from heartburn, Rennie, fall back in love with food.
We want to show theatre. We want to show people about power.
Individually, they may be strong, put them together, they're unbreakable.
I think you have to listen to all this.
History Films, every night this week at 9 on Sky History.
Welcome back to our year in review. We turn now to our panelist choices for what would have been their big story of the year. if it wasn't for that pesky pandemic. Let's start with Kate. Now, we promised we didn't just book you because you are an American, but it is certainly helpful. From COVID, from the election, Black Lives Matter, what is going on in America? What an extraordinary year.
It has been, and the US presidential election and the lead up to it would have certainly been my story had it not been for the COVID crisis, because it's not a straightforward narrative. The terrible killing of George Floyd in May really blew the lid off the pressure cooker that is race relations in America and had been building for some time.